So for the back side, go ahead and write this down so that I can go over it. These are some basic rules that you learn in 8th grade. Product rule. When you have a to the 7th power times a to the 3rd power, what that means is that you're going to have to add your exponents, which is going to give you a to the 10th power. That would be how you would apply the product rule. If you have the power rule, that means that you're actually going to multiply these two exponents. Whoops. So you're going to have to multiply them, which would give you a to the 21st power. So it is a different format. Right here, you're multiplying them. Right here, it's raised to another power. Okay, so keep that in mind while we're going over this. Now, for the square root, the I to the 1st power, remember we went over what that means. So if you have the square root of -1, that's what's going to give you your I. And if you have the square root of -1 squared, that's what's going to give you your -1. These are the two main ones that you want to remember, because that's what I'm going to branch everything off of. So anytime you have the square root of -1, that's going to be I. The square root of -1 to the 2nd power, that's -1. So what that is telling you is I to the 1st power is I to the 2nd power is -2. These are the most important ones. So now from there, let's derive the rest. So I to the 3rd power, notice how I always want to start with I squared, okay? So I squared, I have to ask myself, okay, is there a number that I can multiply this 2 by that will give me a 3? Okay, so if I would use the power rule. Because there's no number other than 1, okay, I'm not going to be able to use that one. So I'm going to have to look at my other one, which is I to the 1st power. So right here, this is technically I to the 1st power. Remember, when they look like this is a product rule. So that's this one. That means your exponents, you're going to add those exponents. Okay, so that's how we're getting the 3. So that's how you know you're doing it right. So now from here, I squared, if you look over here, I squared is -1. So that you're basically saying -1, and then your I to the 1st power, that's an I only. So this is what you're saying, which means that your answer here is -I. So I'm going to go over I to the 4th power so you guys can see, and I'll do all of them so you guys can kind of understand it, but you do have to understand this chart, okay? Again, the only ones you're memorizing is basically I to the 1st power, that equals I, and I to the 2nd power, that is always -1. So I to the 4th power, I'm going to start with I squared again. Now I'm going to ask myself, 2 times what? Will I ever get 4 to get by multiplying by anything by 2? And that I do get that. So I squared times 2, that's 4. That's the one that I want here. So remember, I squared is -1 from earlier. I squared is -1. And if you were to put this on your calculator, -1 squared, your answer would actually be a +1. Okay, because -1 times -1 is +1. So now let's look at the next one. I to the 5th power. Again, start off with I to the 2nd power. Now, I to the 2nd power, there is no number that I can multiply that will ever give me 5. However, if I multiply this by 2, that gives me 4. I need one more to add, which means I'm going to write it like this. Now, I squared is -1, and I'm going to do -1 squared times I. Now, remember that -1 squared is just 1, because -1 times -1. So then 1 times I is just I. So I to the 6th power. Again, I'm going to start with I squared. I'm always starting with I squared. So I squared. 2 times 3 will give me 6. So that's good. So I squared is always -1. But now I have to the 3rd power. So -1 times -1 times -1, that's -1. Okay, and then I to the 7th power. Again, always start with 2. 2 times nothing will ever give me 7, but 2 times 3 gives me 6. And if I multiply one more I, which means I'm going to add it, that will give me my 7. So now from here, I have the I squared, which is -1, cubed times I. So -1 cubed is -1 times -1 times -1. That is -1. times your I, this is negative I. Now, please don't just copy this chart down without understanding it, because you do, later on, you're going to have to, like, I can give you I to the 1,000,002. I can give you I to the 557. So you have to be able to understand the patterns. So now I to the 8th power. So I'm going to do I to the 2nd power times 4. That gives me 8. So I don't have to add that extra I anymore. I squared is negative 1. Negative 1 to the 4th power is negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1, which will give me 1. Now, make sure you're putting parentheses for that. Otherwise, it's going to generate the wrong answer. So let's go over 13 and 14. So I to the 15th power, again, always start with I squared. I squared times, if I multiply this one by 7, that gives me 14. That means I'm going to need one more I to make that 15. Now, remember that I squared is negative 1. And negative 1 to the 7th power is actually going to be negative 1. But you still have that I, which means that this is negative I as your final answer. So now let's do 14. I to the 62 power. So again, start with I squared. 2 times what gives me 62, which is actually 31. So I don't have to add an extra I anymore because I got exactly 62. Now, I squared is negative 1. You're going to square that, or not square that, sorry. You're going to raise that to the 31st power. Again, put it with parentheses in the calculator. When you do negative 1 to the 31st power, your answer here is going to be negative 1. So let's go ahead and move on to the next ones. So now from this one, it says simplify the expressions below. So you have 4i times 7i. So 4 times 7 is, 4 times 7 is 28. Now the I and the I, think about it as x times x. X times x is x squared because basically you're adding those exponents. Now I times I is I squared. But if you remember, I said I squared is equal to negative 1, which means this is 28 times I squared, so 28 times negative 1. So your answer is negative 28. And then I'm going to go ahead and do number 16 next. So this whole thing right here, where take out the I first, that'll come into play in a little bit. There is no I to take out. They're already there. So now I'm going to go ahead and do this one. I'm going to do negative 4 times 2 times negative 9. So we know, and make sure if you're using a calculator, you're being careful with those negatives. So we're going to get positive 72. And then you have 3 i's. So that's I cubed, because I times I times I. So I times I times I, it's I cubed. But remember, this is where I said you have to know your patterns. So I cubed, I need to break that down. So if I look at this, always start with I squared. I squared times nothing will ever give me 3. However, if I multiply it by an I can add and get 3. So I know that I squared is negative 1. So this is negative 1, which will give me negative 72, I as my final answer. So now let's look at the next ones. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and do probably 18 and 20, and I think that's it. So for 18, this is where, not 18. I'm probably going to do 18 and 20. So if you look here, you're going to be dealing with your I square root of 3 squared. So they're basically saying I squared and square root of 3 squared, because you have to apply it to everything, times negative 8 squared I squared. So all I'm doing is basically applying that square to everything. Okay, so I squared is negative 1. And the square root of 3 squared, if you put that on the calculator, it's just 3. The reason for that is because If you have the square root of 3 times the square root of 3, that's the square root of 9, and the square root of 9 is just 3. Okay? Now, negative 8 squared, that's going to be 64. And then I squared is going to be your negative 1. And now you have no i's left over. So then you would just have to multiply them. So you would have your 3 times your 64. You'd get 1, and then times your negative 1 and your negative 1, which makes it a positive. So you're going to end up getting a positive 192. The next one that I'll do is number 20. This is where taking out the I first comes into play. Notice how here you can see the I. You can see the I. But over here there's I's. You just can't see them. So on the square root of negative 24, remember that this can be rewritten as I. Whoops. Let's rewrite it this way. It can be rewritten as negative 1. The square root of negative 1 times the square root of 24. This one can be rewritten as negative 1 times the square root of 3. And the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 2. Now remember that all of these negative 1s, these are all i's. So I have 1, 2, 3. And you're multiplying all of them. Okay. Whoops. Hold on. Alright. So you're multiplying them. So you basically have I to the third power. Okay, but you still have all of these square roots here as well. My advice to you is multiply all the square roots together and then simplify. So I'm going to be left with I cubed. And then you're going to be multiplying the 24 times the 3 times the 2, which is 144. Now you're going to simplify this. Now, first of all, we know that the square root of 144 is just 12. Now the I to the third power, you're going to have to break that down. Always start from I squared. So I get I squared times I. This is negative 1 times I. This is going to give me negative 1. Which means you're going to, negative I, not negative 1. So negative I. Which means this is going to be negative I. Which will turn into negative 12I. Because it's basically a negative 1 times I. So go ahead and work on the rest of these. I did give you the answers so you guys can check your work. And then I think that was it. Alright, so go ahead and get started on those.